the speaker for all of the sessions today, this evening from 6 to 8, and then Monday through Wednesday evening from 6 to 8, all on different topics about the founding of America and how the Christian faith was interwoven with that. And without further ado, I will turn things over to Mr. Cox.
Well, thank you so much. It's a blessing to be here. Thank you for having our ministry back, Grace Tree Foundation. Who was here to see the dinosaurs when they were here? All right, very good. Yes, I have old dead people that I bring in my presentation. Anyway, so this morning I was just going to kind of give you a little intro, cover one specific event that took place in our American founding. And then tonight we'll get back and kind of just really get going. We'll start with the Pilgrims. Contrast how the Plymouth colony went versus the Jamestown colony. Then the next night we'll get right into what built up to the Revolution and how that all took place and the Declaration of Independence, but the miraculous things that took place that preserved that effort and eventually propelled us to a victory in that war for freedom, for liberty. Then we'll go into how the Republic was kind of built and centered the central figure that, in my humble, biased opinion, if it weren't for him, we would not have a country. And then we will round up the evenings with Wednesday night, and we will deal with the issue of how we treat one another and look at how slavery has manifested itself both scripturally, historically, and in American history. So this morning, we're kind of going to pick up at a spot, a juncture in the founding of America that really propelled things into why we would have the conflicts we would have that would bring us into a Revolutionary War. So the decades following the success of the Plymouth colony saw tens of thousands of people begin to move to America. They started seeing how things actually could be successful and go here. And so we eventually had all of our colonies. We had Virginia back in 1624, and then Maryland, and then Rhode Island, Connecticut, Carolina, which eventually got split in two. That's right. You been there? Very good. North and South. New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Pennsylvania, and finally, little old Georgia came along in 1732. And we go from a population of about 1,980 people in 1625, when we just had our two little colonies we were getting started, to 2.4 million people 150 years later in 1775. This place was booming. Huge numbers of people wanting to come here because of the opportunities it afforded. Parliament is 2 months away by boat, okay, across the ocean. So, and during that time, while the what would become known as the Whigs, the more liberals, were in charge of Parliament, they're like, let them do what they want. Let them prosper. Okay. Now, everything had to have a final say by the king. He could veto anything. He had a council here in the colonies that could oversee whether or not a law was passed, and eventually it would go all the way to the king. And so you had a 3-month window there. You passed a law, and you could operate by that law until the king either vetoed or not, and you finally got word from it, about 5 months later. Well, if you knew the king might veto it, how long might you make that law last for? About 4 months, exactly. And so then after that, you just write a new one after that, and then it's got to take another. So you see, we had it good. We had it good. We knew how to get around the laws. We knew how to do our own taxes, our own regulations. And for the most part, Parliament was good with that. And the place exploded, not just in opportunity, but with success and with prosperity for those who would take the risk and put forth the incredible effort. And it's a wonderful lesson from history that it seems the less government is involved in people's lives, how do they do? So much better. So much better. Well, things begin to change, though, in the 1750s. During that time, you had 75,000 French traders and soldiers, fur traders and soldiers, begin moving down the river systems like the Ohio Valley system and the Mississippi and all that, and coming into all this territory and establishing many, many forts and trading posts and establishing pretty good relations with the Native Americans. Many of them, they would marry the daughters of the chiefs and creating very strong bonds between the French and the Indians. Well, there's 1.5 million British colonists over on the coast, you know that because that's where their colonies were along the coast, and they pretty much were like, well, that's okay, except for those of us who have invested in the Ohio Company. Ohio. That was going to be our expansion out west for those who were invested in this, for real estate purposes, for trading purposes, to get in on the lucrative fur trades and all that kind of stuff. And so they're like, this is not good. The French are taking over, and we want to have, you know, we're planning on this being a good investment. A couple of guys invested in this are the governor of Virginia, okay, Governor Robert Dinwiddie, and now, why are you smirking at his name? That's not very nice. Governor Dinwiddie, okay? And a couple of young men named Augustine and Lawrence Washington. They are the older half-brothers to George Washington, exactly. Now, Lawrence will end up dying from tuberculosis before all this takes place, and we'll find out more about that on Tuesday night. But needless to say, the governor is wanting to, he doesn't like this. This is not good. All these French coming into the territory that they were going to take advantage of and have great prosperity from. So in October of 1753, Governor Dinwiddie calls upon a 21-year-old Major George Washington of the Virginia Regiment to begin building to take a little correspondence to French General Saint-Pierre at Fort Le Boeuf. Okay, it's French. Okay, Fort Le Boeuf. Okay, that's up in the northwestern part of today's Pennsylvania, up near the lake. And so he's an accomplished surveyor. He can navigate through all that just fine. And so he does. He begins to go on that trip. He finally gets there, and the French general has Major Washington come in. Sit down, have a nice dinner. They have a very lovely meal. It's very yummy. And they had cordially talk about things, everything. And Major Washington presents the request from the governor of Virginia on behalf of the British Empire to remove themselves from the claimed British territory, to which he says, "Nah." And so this is now French territory, and so General Washington says, "Thank you very much." He goes back and he tells Governor Dinwiddie that it's not going to happen. So Governor Dinwiddie then, in May of 1754, is going to send George Washington to begin to head towards Fort Duquesne. Fort Duquesne has been built at the confluence of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers, and where they come together starts the Ohio River. Pretty good spot for a fort. Many years later, they will eventually take that fort from the British or from the French and rename it Fort Pitt, and today it is now known as Pittsburgh. Exactly. Now, so he's going to send George Washington to go do this. Okay. George's main objective is to build the road, start plowing a road so that British forces can come through and eventually get to that fort. And George, of course, wants to be good and at his job here. He's very excited to go do it. And he rounds up about 186 guys to come with him, and they start cutting through the woods and everything and making this fort, this road that will actually become kind of popular later on. It'll eventually lead into becoming the first U.S. national highway that is commissioned under President Jefferson. Becomes known as Braddock's Road. It becomes later US 40. And then, but anyway, so they start plowing this road, and he's making it along the way, and he comes upon this nice, big, beautiful open meadow there in southwestern Pennsylvania, today's southwestern Pennsylvania. It's just beautiful because it's thick woods. You know, the old adage, you used to be able to go from the Atlantic all the way to the Mississippi. A squirrel could go all the way without ever touching the ground because of how thick the trees were. Okay? Well, there's nice big open green meadow there. George's like, this is a great place to set up camp. Okay, we're going to set up camp. So they set up camp. And from there, they kind of use that as their little spot where they're going to go places. And they're not too far from the Redstone Creek. He wants to get the road to there because that goes right into the Monongahela River, which then goes right up to the fort. He's like, that would be really good if I can get our road to there. He finds out from one of his allies, his Native American allies, the Seneca chief Tanaka Hudson. Thank you. I have no idea if I said that right. Half King. Okay, translates to the Half King. Okay, they call him the Half King. That there is a group, about 30, 35 French coming from Fort Duquesne because they've heard of this. There's these English guys coming. And they're coming down with their own piece of paper saying, this is French territory. You need to leave and go back to your territory of Virginia. Washington thinks, ooh, this is a good opportunity. This is a good opportunity. I can like capture them, you know, or do something like that. So he goes up to this little spot. There's this big ridge in that area. It's pretty kind of hilly mountain. We're in the Appalachia, okay? There's this big ridge. I think it's called Chestnut Ridge. And he goes up there and he's coming around. He's got about 40 guys plus about a dozen Native Americans. And they come up over this little ledge, and down there at the bottom is the French encampment. Okay? And down there at the bottom in the French encampment, they're down there waking up in the morning, getting ready and everything. And there's a couple, we're not exactly sure how it all got started, but most likely one of those French just happens to turn or hear a twig snap or something like that, and he's like, you know, he starts yelling out everything, and they all start scrambling everything. And so George is up here on top. They can shoot down. He's got some guys coming in from the side, and the Half King is bringing his natives in from the other side. And within minutes, they've got them cornered. They've got them captured. They surrender, okay, because they don't want to kill. While they're signing the surrender papers, the Half King kills the commanding officer of the French, Joseph Coulon de Jumonville. To this day, that location is known as Jumonville Glen, after the gentleman who was killed there. George is like, no, stop, we don't do that. No, they surrendered. They're not supposed to do that. Well, they sign the surrender papers, and he takes some of them captive, and he sends, lets a couple of them go free, lets them surrender, go back to their fort, while they kept some as their prisoners of war. Well, word gets back to the fort that Jumonville was assassinated. He was killed in cold blood. His brother, General Louis Coulon de Villers, you say de Villers? De Villers, he asks Saint-Pierre, he's like, can I lead the attack on this group for the honor of our king and for revenge of my brother being killed? And he says, yes, you can lead it. So they begin to lead a force. They're going to send a force, some estimates are up to 700 people of Native Americans and French to come on to it. Well, George is like, oh, this is not good. And so, because he's only got about 400 guys. He had a group of British. He had about 100, 200 guys. And then there's about 100, 200 British actual regulars that were coming. But their commanding officer, Colonel Joshua Fry, he was the next big thing. He was in all the newspapers. He was fancy. He was good looking, excellent tactician. He falls off his horse and breaks his neck on the way. So that leaves George Washington to be in charge of this group when they get there. And so George is in charge of all of it. He gets kind of a field promotion to colonel, or lieutenant colonel. And so he's like, okay, that big open meadow where we set up our camp, let's build a little fort there. Okay. Now, if you see the picture of the place, it's just a big glorified wooden fence. Okay, about 8 foot, 9 foot tall fence posts, not very big. About as wide as this, actually about this circumference here, about as all big. And there's a storehouse in the middle of it. So along that, though, they build up some earthworks they can kind of hide behind, and they be ready for them, and they can see them coming from the distance. Well, things didn't go quite as he had hoped. On July 3rd, 1754. They are there ready, and the whole day before it rains, and it rains during it. Well, that gets all their ammunition wet. Their little ditches they're going to be in are all soaking wet. It's not good. Plus, when the French attack, the Native Americans climb up in the trees and start shooting right down at them. Easy targets. This is not good. So they have to try to squeeze in and retreat into this little bit. You imagine putting 400 people in this amount of room right here. That's no. Okay. It's not going well. Not going well at all. Finally, that evening, the French, de Villers, sends a man under white flag, to offer terms of surrender for Washington and his troops. Washington hadn't surrendered yet after all that. Washington negotiates for about 2-3 hours, actually, because he's like, I'm not going to let my guys go home without their guns. Why? Well, there's the potential of being attacked, yes, but why are the guns so essential to these guys? Got to have something to eat. That was one of your main sources of food, was being able to go hunting, okay? So he's like, they're not leaving without that, and of course all the dignity. So Washington does this negotiating for about 2 hours. Now, according to the National Park Service, when you go there, they say actually it seemed like 700, but they only had about 500, and about 300 of them were Native Americans, and they're all about to leave that night and not come back. If they do that, Washington will have the upper hand if he just holds out and waits for the next day. Well, he doesn't know that. And in fact, the French general, after 2 hours of negotiating, finally says, well, I don't know how much longer I can keep the savages at bay, making a threat that they're going to come in at them and just kill all of them. So Washington agrees to the surrender, but makes his terms are in there. Now, here's the problem, though. He speaks English, they speak French. He needs a translator. His translator was killed. But there's another gentleman in his army who speaks Dutch, okay? And he knows French and he knows English pretty good. So what he has to do is he has to translate the French into Dutch and then the Dutch into English. Okay, you all see how this is going to go. Plus, it's raining, it's wet. How neat does that look? A little messy, the ink's running a little bit. Okay, there it is. Okay, well, to this day, according to Gentleman Matthew, who I talked to the National Park Service when I was there, he says, to this day, as far as he knows, the Dutch do not have a word for assassinate. They just don't have a word for it. It's just kill. Okay? Well, in the French wording here, up here in this section here, and right over here as well, and then you can pass that around later, but take a look at it. The French have written down that the British, the Virginia forces, have in cold blood assassinated, is the word they use, his brother Jumonville. George doesn't know that. It says that because when the Dutch guy translates, it just says, and he was killed in the battle. It doesn't say he was assassinated. George would never have ever admitted that he was assassinated, because that is not something you want to get back to Europe, that we assassinated one of the French. He doesn't know that. It just says killed according to him. Well, it ends up saying assassinated. George and his troops the very next morning are allowed to leave under full peace and full honors of the military, if you read the English translation of it, in the full honors of the military with their drums and everything, with their guns and all that stuff. They had to leave a couple guys behind as hostages or as prisoners, so that the guys they had captured, they will do an exchange eventually, okay, and all that good. But anyway, George has lost 31 men were killed, and the French had only lost 3. They get back to Virginia, the House of Burgesses there, where they're given a hero's welcome. Way to go. You did a good job. You fought with honor. You stood up against them. You had overwhelming odds, but we appreciate it. George was like, we didn't win. He's like, it's kind of embarrassing. But hey, it was okay. Well, so word of this gets back to Europe, what all has happened. And the English decide they're going to send a big expeditionary force to dislodge the French, kick the French out of there. The French find out about this, and they're going to send 6 regiments, not to mention the official, because George's name is on that. You look at it, George signed it. The official admission that one of their soldiers, their officers, was assassinated in cold blood doesn't go over very well. And so they decide, well, we're going to send 6 regiments of reinforcements to make sure the British don't kick us out. And then the British decide, well, we're going to send our fleet to block your forces so they can't leave in February of 55. Well, the French find out they're going to do that, so they just send their forces earlier so they don't get there. Well, the British get there and like, well, that stinks. We're just going to attack any and all French ships because we're just mad. And then it just fires. All of a sudden, Britain officially declares war May 17th, 1756. Britain's ally, Prussia, mostly a German state, joins them. France's allies of Austria and Russia join them, and thus ensues what becomes known as the 7 Years' War. Guess how long it lasted? 7 years. How did they know to name it the 7 Years' War when it started? Does that not blow your mind? Okay. Anyway, last 7 years. And you could consider it to be one of the earliest global world wars, as conflict takes place on every continent except for Australia and Antarctica during that war. All because George Washington went and had dinner with a French guy. You know. So, the British, their forces come, they arrive. General Edward Braddock is placed in charge of the overall American colony effort in this war. Again, this is a global war. Okay, there's General Edward Braddock there. In April 1755, he arrives and he calls Colonel George Washington and says, no, they didn't actually have telephones. Okay, all right. But anyway, so he called him and says, Colonel Washington, I need you to come help me with this. You know the road. You helped build majority of that road, and you know the territory. I want you to come be an advisor for all this. George was very hesitant because one of the things that always ticked him off was the people his officers in the Virginia Regiment, which is a British colony serving the king, were never ever given full British rank and British recognition. That always really bothered him. So he was always kind of hesitant about it. But anyway, so he's like, okay, yes, I will come do that. His mother finds out and goes rushing over to Mount Vernon, where he was now living because of his older brother's death, and basically comes and says, how can you do this to your mother? How can you put yourself in danger? Oh, don't do this. And here's what we have recorded from George that he said to her, quote, the God to whom you commended me, madam, when I set out upon a more perilous errand, defended me from all harm, and I trust he will do so now. Do not you? Who did George Washington trust for his safety? His creator God. Exactly. Okay. So she's like, okay, fine, you can go. So he does. And he thinks this is going to be a cakewalk, okay? I have the entire British Army at my disposal this time. In fact, they're going to have 2,100 soldiers on this. And they're going to take off on May 29th from Fort Cumberland, which is just down in Maryland. And they're going to be coming up to, I should be going like this way, up to Fort Duquesne to take that fort, finally. George is like, woo, okay? He's actually going to take him 3 tries. But anyway, so George, he's going on this trip, and he's going to, and there's so many of them, and the road is not wide enough to General Braddock's liking, that the convoy stretches 4 miles long. 4 miles long with all the wagons and the soldiers and the cannon and all that stuff and all the cows. Think about how many cows you got to bring along for butchering to feed 2,100 men for however many weeks. Okay? I mean, so these things, these are a long expedition, okay? Well, it's taking forever. And every single little spot in the road that wasn't quite wide enough, well, we have to cut those trees, and Washington's like, they're making mountains out of molehills. This is driving me crazy. Just go, whatever. Not to mention, George has gotten sick. He's got sweats, he's got fever, major headaches and everything. And Braddock's like, fine, okay, we're going to split up. I'm going to take 1,300 guys, and we're going to be the flying column. We're going to get up there and attack, okay? Because the fort's lightly defended, so we think. And you guys, you just catch up our supply, our reinforcements when you can get there, okay? All right, fine. George, you're coming with us. George is like, okay. Actually, George insisted on going. He's like, no, you're sick, stay here. And George, no, I'm going. Of course, he has to ride in the hospital wagon, which is bumpy, wooden, all the time with severe headaches. How do you think that felt? Not very good. Okay. So, June 19th, they take off, the flying column. Along the way, they come across some friendly Native Americans who don't like what the French have been doing and those who have allied themselves, and they offer their support. George is like, this is great, fine, just listen to them, I can sleep in the wagon. General Braddock's like, what do we need them for? We're British Army, we don't need them. Finally, after a few days of not listening to them and just ignoring them the whole time, they get up and leave. And George is like, come here. This is not open field warfare like Europe. We're in the woods. We're in the trees. We need scouts. We need to know what's going on. We need alerts if people are coming. This is totally different. Now, Braddock knew that, okay? In some of the writings, Benjamin Franklin, when he talked about this, he said they knew that. They were prepared for ambush. Didn't matter, though. We're proud British. We can't be defeated. Okay. So they go on. On July 7th, they come within 12 miles of Fort Duquesne. On the 8th, more friendly Indians arrive to offer their assistance. Once again, they are shunned by Braddock, much to George Washington's chagrin. He's like, what are you doing? Finally, July 9th, 1755, they're within 10 miles of the fort, walking along the Monongahela River. And here's how George Washington describes the scene. He says this, quote, every man was neatly dressed in full uniform. The soldiers were arranged in columns and marched in exact order. The sun gleamed from their burnished arms. The river flowed tranquilly on the right, and the deep forest overshadowed them with solemn grandeur on the left. Officers and men were equally inspirited with cheering hopes and confident anticipations. And again, they had reason to be. They thought the fort was lightly defended, and it was until 1,600 more soldiers had arrived, Native Americans and Canadian reinforcements, and so they were now not so lightly defended. They send out 108 French regulars, 146 Canadian militiamen, 637 Indians for a combined force of 891 to come up and set up an ambush for these 1,300 to walk into. They're kind of ready to set a trap for them. Well, what they didn't know, though, was that General Braddock had sent Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Gage in advance with 350 guys. And so at about 1 o'clock, about 7 miles from the fort, the 891 French guys, they're walking along, getting ready to set up their ambush, and here come the 350 British, and all of a sudden they're like, oh, hey, and they start shooting at each other, and it's crazy, and the guns go off and everything, and the British are like, oh, this is not good. They turn around, they start running back to General Braddock. Well, General Braddock is back there with his other 950. He hears the firing, the shots. He's like, oh, we better hurry up and catch up to him. So you have 350 running this way, 950 running this way, and guess what happens? Crash! Yes, it's a disaster. They run into each other like, what's going on? They're behind us. They're attacking. What's going on? And they start fighting, and there are bullets coming from everywhere. Coming from all around the sides, coming from the trees, coming from any and all directions. They have no idea what's going on. Plus the deafening whoop, whoop, cries of the Native Americans coming around and attacking and all this kind of stuff. It is absolutely, you turn and shoot this way, you look at your comrade, he's looking that way, you turn around, you look there, and all of a sudden his scalp is right there on the tree next to you. That's how fast this was happening. Absolute chaos. They are wanting to run away. The Virginia guys, they're like, forget this, we're jumping in the woods. And they do. They jump into the woods, and they start fighting that way, okay? And General Braddock rides up and says, and what is going on here? Look at this chaos. And look at, how dare they shoot from the trees? That's kind of his response. So he starts ordering, get in your formations, your regular lines like we always do this. You know what you're supposed to do. They're like, what? Are you crazy? He actually will run up to officers and soldiers, this is what's reported, with his sword and hit them in the back with his sword from his horse, telling them to get in line. He is not fazed by this. No, we're going to fight. And sure enough, it kind of inspires his officers and his men, and they start getting in their lines, and they start firing. They actually put up a resistance for about 3 hours. And they're kind of holding their ground and not doing too bad. Officer after officer after officer, though, is dropping like flies. George Washington is running back and forth on his horse, trying to carry the orders from Braddock to the other guys, all, still recovering from his headache and everything. And finally, after about 3 hours of all this, General Braddock eventually takes a bullet to the chest. And at that point, they said, well, we got to retreat. Washington actually organizes the retreat, and they do so. They head out. And thankfully for them, the French and the natives, they don't know how many forces there's in reserve for the British. They don't know what they have left around, so they decide not to pursue, and so they're able to get back. And as they are doing that retreat, they end up leaving wagons, guns, artillery, cattle, horses, baggage, provisions, 25,000 pounds of British currency, Braddock's personal papers, and one of the baggage wagons that was being driven during all of that, Native Americans start piling on it to attack the guys on it, and the two guys on that baggage wagon are a couple of cousins named Daniel Morgan and Daniel Boone. Daniel Boone jumps off, cuts the reins from the horse, pulls the thing, and they ride off on the horses to escape. It's like right out of a movie. I mean, isn't it great? Well, of the 1,300 British forces, 456 are killed, 422 are wounded. Out of 86 officers, 63 are wounded. 26 of them died. Of the 50 women who had accompanied them as maids and cooks and all that, 4 make it back. Half were killed, half taken prisoner. The French had only suffered 27 killed, 57 wounded. That's it. On July 13th, Braddock succumbs to his wounds, and he dies. The chaplain had been killed in the fighting, and so Washington, being kind of the senior officer, he conducts the funeral service for him. And they bury him in the road there, and they run over it after they bury him with a bunch, with their wagons, with their horses. They walk over because they're afraid of Native Americans maybe finding it and desecrating the grave and taking, doing whatever they might do to it. Well, interesting enough, in 1804, as they're coming through to start building that national road, they're digging and they dig up some bones and some little buttons, brass buttons with it. And they're like, what is this? And they're like, oh, well, old Fort Necessity's right over there, because that's where they got back to, was right outside of Fort Necessity, about 2 miles from it. They're like, oh, this might be General Braddock. And so they were able to save, what bones were there and all that kind of stuff. And finally, in 1913, they built this nice big marble monument. I've got pictures of it and everything. That's right along the highway. People drive by it all the time. Have no idea, and where he's actually now buried there. Well, Washington gets the army back to Colonel Thomas Dunbar, who was back with the other group of soldiers. They finally get back to Fort Cumberland, where they're fine. And the 7 Years' War continues on for a total of 7 years. Yes, exactly, okay? Goes on for all that time. Eventually what happens is, in 1762, the Russians switch sides as Tsar Peter III takes over. So that put Britain, Ireland, Prussia, Portugal, Hanover, and Russia against France, Austria, Saxony, Spain, and Sweden. See how this was a global war, okay, because of all the territories those. And so they finally, in 1763, they have the Treaty of Paris and the Treaty of Hubertsburg, and finally that's all in, okay? Eventually what will happen is later the Forbes expedition will get Fort Duquesne, and after that one, Washington's finally able to resign, and go live at home, okay? Took him 3 tries, but they finally did get the fort, renamed it Fort Pitt, and then it became Pittsburgh. British get a lot of territory out of this. A lot of territory. The French had just gone on the basis of just protect the motherland, the homeland. That's all we want to do. Because of the past when they had been taken over and they didn't want that to happen again. The British were like, we're using our mighty navy to get as much territory as we possibly can. And so they get all of this area in North America. The French will eventually surrender it, and it all becomes British territory. They also get Spanish Florida and a bunch of the Caribbean islands. The Spanish get Cuba, the Philippines, Louisiana, and land west of the Mississippi. Everyone, though, has a massive amount of war debt. Because it hadn't been too many years before that, there was also a big war in Europe. And so now we have that one. Now we have this one that lasted for 7 years. And there are altogether, all the countries included, around 1 million casualties from this war. This is going to lead to a transition in political philosophy in Parliament, as halfway through that war, a new king came to power, and he was not of the liberal Whigs, he was of the conservative Tories, who believed there should be strict, absolute control over these colonies, and we should determine everything that happens in those colonies, including their taxation, because we're in great debt. Great Britain needs a great amount of money to replenish the treasury, and that's going to lead to everything that takes place tomorrow night that we're going to cover, okay? So, you're like, okay, then, what was the point of all this morning then? I mean, it's a fun story, but what does that have to do with 8 episodes a day? A few days after the whole ordeal there, after General Braddock is dead and they get back to Fort Cumberland to safety, George begins to write a letter to his mother to let her know, I'm okay, I'm fine, although I'm pretty weak, pretty tired from 10 days of sickness and from all the fighting and the traveling and everything. He also writes to the governor, and he writes to his brother, okay? And I'll send this around, see if you want to read more of it. But I just made this, so it looks kind of cool, But these are the exact wordings, and the things that are crossed out are the things he crossed out, okay, and all that kind of stuff. He wrote to his brother John, younger brother, July 18th, and he says this: As I have heard since my arrival at this place, a circumstantial account of my death and dying speech, I take this early opportunity of contradicting the first and of assuring you that I have not as yet composed the latter. But by the all-powerful dispense of providence, capital P, I have been protected beyond all human probability and expectation, for I had 4 bullets through my coat. He took his coat off, and what was in it? 4 bullet holes. And had 2 horses shot under me. Yet, although death was leveling my companions on every side of me, I escaped unhurt. Let me pass that around. Who did he think had protected him? His God, absolutely. The same God you and I worship. And he wasn't the only one to notice that. Mary Draper Ingalls was one of those ladies who was captured and taken back to the French fort. And while she was there, she heard some of them talking and everything, and she heard the name Washington, and she asked, and used a translator, what happened, is he okay, and everything. And one of the Frenchmen tells her that the Indian chief who was leading the group had shot 11 times at Washington, and because his gun had never missed before or since, the chief believed Washington had been protected by a great spirit. On August 17th of that year, preacher Samuel Davies, he would become president of Princeton, delivered a message to Captain Overton's Independent Company of Volunteers in Hanover County, Virginia. The sermon was entitled, Religion and Patriotism, the Constituents of a Good Soldier. And in that sermon, he said, talking about what had happened to Washington, so you notice word is getting around very quickly about what happened. And was Washington the one spreading the word? Absolutely not. This is the last thing he wanted, was for anybody to know about this. The preacher, Davies, said, quote, I may point out to the public that heroic youth, Colonel Washington, whom I cannot but hope Providence has hitherto preserved in so signal a manner for some important service to his country. Then in 1770, George Washington and his friend, Dr. James Craig, are surveying some land. Washington purchased a bunch of territory out there eventually, and they're exploring western frontiers. And along today's Ohio-West Virginia border, they come across a Native American tribe, and the chief insists on speaking. This is what Dr. Craig wrote as an eyewitness to what the chief said. Okay, so this is what has been recorded for us. And here's what the chief said when he met Washington. This is 15 years later now. He said this: I am chief and ruler over many tribes. My influence extends to the waters of the Great Lakes and to the far blue mountains. I have traveled a long and weary path that I might see the young warrior of the great battle. It was on the day when the white man's blood mixed with the streams of our forest that I first beheld this chief. Who's he pointing to? Washington. I called to my young men and said, Mark yon tall and daring warrior. Is he not of the redcoat tribe? He hath an Indian's wisdom, and his warriors fight as we do. Why did he say that? Because what were all the Virginia soldiers doing? Hiding in the trees. They were fighting in the trees. They weren't like the redcoats who were all standing in a nice, easy-to-shoot-at line. Okay? Himself is alone, exposed. Quick, let your aim be certain, and he dies. Our rifles were leveled, rifles which, but for you, knew not how to miss. 'Twas all in vain. A power mightier far than we shielded you. Seeing you were under the special guardianship of the Great Spirit, we immediately ceased to fire at you. I am old, and soon shall be gathered to the great council fire of my fathers in the land of shades. But ere I go, there's something bids me speak in the voice of prophecy. Listen! The Great Spirit protects that man and guides his destinies. He will become the chief of nations, and a people yet unborn will hail him as the founder of a mighty empire. I am come to pay homage to the man who is the particular favorite of heaven and who can never die in battle. I'd love to see the look on Washington's face, wouldn't you? And guess how many wounds George Washington ever received in battle? None. None. And there are accounts of when British soldiers had him dead to rights in their scopes. There's like the Battle of Princeton when his soldiers started to retreat, but he knew there were reserves coming, so he rides out into the open field between the shooting British and shooting colonials to encourage them to keep going, and never gets a shot. He's usually the tallest guy on a horse. You'd think he'd be an easy target. And never once did he receive a wound in any battle. The miracle of the protective shield of George Washington continued through that time and through the Revolution. And that's great. That's amazing. That's wonderful. Certainly divine providence in his life. What in the world does that have to do with any of us here this morning? Well, for one, it once again is amongst the endless examples, and we'll show more of them tonight and tomorrow night, of the Lord intervening in the establishment of this country. Now, again, just so you know where I'm coming from, I'm not one of these guys that's like, the Lord needed the United States of America, and he created this amazing country to carry out his will throughout all the world. That's no. For me, as you'll see tonight, the people who came here that were faithful to them, that had the foundation that you heard about this morning. What's that foundation? That's right. The Word of God. Those who were faithful to that, guess who the Lord blessed and then brought incredible results to? And that's how this country was founded. And we're going to see that tonight, okay? But aside from showing us that, this used to be, this story of George Washington and the 4 bullet holes, how many knew that story? Okay, all right. How many of you think most of the young people going through our current government-guided education system hear that story? How many of you think it's in any of their history books? This is a school history book from the late 1800s, okay? And on page 84, guess what's in it? This would be a school book for you, for your age, okay? And guess what's right here? The Battle of Fort Duquesne. And down here, it talks about how Washington seemed everywhere present. An Indian chief with his braves especially singled him out. 4 balls passed through his clothes. 2 horses were shot out under him. 15 years after, this old Indian chief came a long way to see the Virginia officer at whom he fired a rifle 15 times without hitting him during the Monongahela fight. Washington never received a wound in battle. This was standard education. Everybody knew that story, true story, about George Washington. Why do we not today? Oh, and also, you flip over just a few more pages, and nope, that's Fort Duquesne. You flip over just a few more pages, and oh, not that one. No, that's Washington crossing that. You have the prayer before the Battle of Bunker Hill. You think that's the name of our textbooks today? Is it? No. Secondly, it shows what can happen in the life of just one faithful person. All Washington ever did was just be mindful of the moment and be faithful in that moment. That's it. He was mindful of the situation, what was around him. I mean, you know 1 Chronicles 12:32 says the sons of Issachar were men who understood the times, knew what they should do. That was George Washington. He wasn't this great evangelist or anything like that. He just was faithful in the moment. He was a devout man of faith. That much we know for certain. Esther was told in Esther 4:14 she was where she was for such a time as this. Just being faithful in the moment. So understand this for all of us here. We're like, well, I'll never have George Washington. I'll never be famous like that. I'll never be a heroic. A successful life is a faithful life. A heroic life is a life that passes on that faith. That's it. That's all it takes to have a successful, heroic life. Be faithful in the moment and pass on that faith. It's not that maybe hard because we're not used to it or we have practice, but is it hard to actually do? Shouldn't be. That's all Washington ever did. He was faithful in the moment. He did what he was supposed to do. Okay? And so, you know, sometimes we think, well, I don't have this great grand story or something. You see, sometimes we have these motivational speakers come in that talk about the horrible life they lived and how they were this close, you know, they were at death's door, you know, and they did this terrible thing and this terrible thing and this terrible thing, but somehow they were delivered from it. Or you hear these incredible testimonies, powerful testimonies of how the Lord intervened and rescued them and saved them, and now they are living for the Lord and they're giving their life to Him and sharing it. And then you ever been in one of those situations? They're coming around and say, okay, now what's your testimony? And you're like, well, I grew up in church. My folks, we took there every time the doors were open. We were there, you know, Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday, youth group, all that kind of stuff. Oh, you kind of see I had a drug problem. I was always drugged to church. You know, and I was in this and that, you know, and now I go today and I try to be active in the church and do stuff and I love the Lord and that's it. Not a very good testimony. Okay, please move on to somebody else. Are you kidding? That's one of the greatest testimonies there can be. Because it has nothing to do with you. It has everything to do with a faithful father or mother or grandfather or grandma or aunt or uncle or neighbor We wanted to make sure you were in the house, gathered with the saints, to hear the preaching of the word, to hear the singing unto the Lord, to meet around his table, to partake of his supper. And they did what they wouldn't let the world dictate what would be done. They wouldn't let a soccer game or a ball practice or an event or some television special or whatever or some trip or keep you, the culture, tell them what they were going to do with their children. They were going to be in the house of the Lord. They were faithful in the moment. That was a successful life. That was a heroic life. So, the choice then for us today is that what we're going to do. If we were raised that way, are we going to continue on generational faithfulness? If we were not raised that way, are we going to start it now? In my house now, as for me in my house, right? Because he's coming after you. He's coming after you. The devil is shooting his arrows at you, but what does Ephesians 6:16 say? We have a shield, a divine shield to protect against the flaming arrows of the evil one. Are you strengthening that shield for you and your family? Because as Hebrews 10:23 says, let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering. Because he who promised is what? Faithful. If you are faithful in the moment, he will be faithful unto you. Heavenly Father, thank you for that incredible truth. Thank you for the assurance we have when we are in Christ. Thank you for the protective shield that is available to us and for our families. That though there could be physical harm and hardship that could possibly come our way, we want that spiritual protection. To know that there's an eternity that awaits us and our families in the arms of our Creator and Savior. Thank you for that hope and that assurance that comes through Jesus Christ, in whose name we pray and commit ourselves. And those who want to be faithful in the moment said, Amen.
Thank you, Ryan. One of the blessings of this sort of ministry is we don't pay like an upfront fee for him to come and teach us these things. We reimburse expenses, but this ministry exists on the generosity of those who come and listen. So on the back table, there's a little basket that you can throw a love offering in to help support the Creation Truth Ministries and all the work they do. So if you feel so compelled, I encourage you to support the ministry in that way. And of course, they also have a lot of resources for individuals, for families to use. So take some time to peruse the bookstore in there as well. We will be back in here at 6 o'clock tonight for the next session, and we thank you for being here. All right. Have a lovely rest of the afternoon.